Before we begin, let me ask you something. If I told you that your deepest fear might not even belong to you, would you believe me? That the panic you feel in the dark, the unease around strangers, even the terror of a spider could all have been planted, node-born s. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most infamous experiments in the history of psychology, a story that begins not with soldiers or prisoners but with a baby, an innocent boy who was taught to be afraid. This story belongs to John B. Watson, the man hailed as the father of behaviorism. A man who claimed he could shape any infant into anything, doctor, artist, criminal, or beggar, simply by controlling their environment. And to prove it, he needed an experiment. He needed a subject without fear, a blank slate. And he found one, a 9-month-old child history would remember only as little Albert. John Brodus Watson was born in South Carolina in 1878. His childhood was marked by hardship, a strict mother, an absent father. He grew up in the shadow of poverty and religious fire, vowing to escape it all with intellect and science. By the early 20th century, psychology was still young, dominated by Freudian ideas of hidden desires, the unconscious mind, but Watson had no patience for that. To him, psychology needed to be scientific, measurable, observable, controlled. He believed thoughts and emotions were not mysteries of the soul, but simply behaviors, responses to stimuli, just like a dog salivating at the sound of a bell. If behavior could be conditioned in animals, why not in humans? It was a radical idea, and Watson had the charisma to make it sound like destiny. In 1913 he published his famous Behaviorist Manifesto declaring, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select." It was bold, it was terrifying. And he was about to put it to the test. In 1920 at Johns Hopkins University, Watson met his perfect subject. Little Albert, just 9 months old, was the child of a nurse who worked at the hospital. To Watson, Albert was ideal, healthy, calm, fearless. Before the experiment, Albert was exposed to a series of objects. A white rat or adder, a rabbit, a dog, masks, even one of Santa Claus. Albert giggled, reached out, he showed no fear. That would soon change. Because Watson wasn't content to observe, he wanted to shape. To prove his theory, he would take this innocent boy and write fear into his mind like ink on paper. The stage was set for one of the darkest experiments in the history of psychology. But before we go there, let me ask you again, if fear can be taught, can it also be untaught? Could you right now unlearn your deepest phobia? Comment below with your answer, because the next chapter may make you question everything you thought you knew about fear. Step with me into the small room at Johns Hopkins University in 1920. There's nothing extraordinary about it. White walls, a simple crib, a few toys scattered on the floor, but what was about to happen here would echo through psychology for more than a century. On this day, John B. Watson and his research assistant Rosalie Rayner prepared to test a radical idea. Could fear itself be manufactured? Could the most basic of human emotions be programmed into a mind as innocent as a child's? Little Albert sat in his crib smiling. In front of him a white laboratory rat scurried across the floor. The boy laughed and reached out, curious and fearless. And then Watson gave the signal. Behind Albert, an assistant struck a steel bar with a hammer. The sound was deafening, jarring, unnatural. Albert startled, his tiny body trembling, his eyes wide with terror, he cried. Watson wasn't finished. Each time Albert reached for the rat, the hammer struck again, the piercing clang, the shock, the tears over and over, pairing the sight of the rat with the sound of fear. It didn't take long. Within days, Albert's joy vanished. He no longer giggled at the rat. He recoiled, whimpered, cried. Fear had been planted where none existed before. But the experiment didn't stop there. Watson and Rayner began to notice something unexpected. The fear spread. When Albert was shown a rabbit, he cried. When a dog entered the room, he whimpered. When Watson placed a mask of Santa Claus on his own face, Albert screamed in terror. Even a ball of cotton or fur was enough to make him turn away in panic. This was stimulus generalization, a single fear radiating outward to anything that resembled the original trigger. From one rat came a cascade of phobias. It was, scientifically speaking, a breakthrough. Watson had proven his point. Fear wasn't innate. It wasn't written into us at birth. It could be conditioned. Like training an animal, if fear could be taught, then so could anger, love, loyalty. But while Watson celebrated his triumph, few paused to ask the darker question, what about Albert? There was no deconditioning, no attempt to undo what had been done. The child was left with his new terrors, condemned to carry them long after the experiment ended. Watson had proven his theory, but at the cost of a boy's innocence. Imagine that for a moment the sight of a rabbit, the brush of cotton, even the jolly face of Santa Claus, forever linked to panic and dread for Albert. The world itself became a maze of hidden triggers, each one echoing with the clang of steel on metal. And yet to Watson this was success. To him Albert was not a victim, he was proof that the mind was clay, that emotions were not sacred mysteries, but programmable reactions, proof that human beings could be molded like machines. The academic world took notice, some were shocked, appalled at the ethics, but many admired the boldness, the clarity, the way Watson had turned psychology from speculation into data. Behaviorism gained momentum, universities taught it, advertisers eyed it, governments noted it. But in that moment, in that small laboratory, none of those consequences were visible. There was only a frightened child, a triumphant scientist, and the sound of a hammer against steel. The experiment of little Albert had succeeded, fear had been created, and with it a door had opened, a door to manipulation, to control, to power. The question now was who would walk through it. Because once you know fear can be programmed, it's only a matter of time before someone tries to program more. The clang of steel against metal may have faded from that laboratory in 1920, but the reverberations carried far beyond. The story of John B. Watson, Rosalie Rayner and little Albert did not end with the experiment. It unfolded into scandal, mystery, and a legacy that still shapes our lives. Let's start with the man at the center, John B. Watson. For Watson, the little Albert experiment was proof of his grand vision. He had shown in the most dramatic way possible that emotions could be conditioned, like reflexes. The scientific world took notice. Behaviorism was no longer just a theory, it was a movement. Watson became a celebrity in psychology, admired for his boldness, his clarity, and his ability to strip human behavior down to observable patterns. But behind the accolades, his personal life was unraveling. Watson had conducted the experiment with his graduate student Rosalie Rayner. Their partnership was more than academic. They were lovers when their affair was discovered. Scandal erupted. Watson's wife divorced him, and Johns Hopkins University, unable to tolerate the public embarrassment, forced him to resign. Just like that, the father of behaviorism was exiled from academia. But Watson did not disappear. Instead, he reinvented himself. He took his theories of conditioning into the world of business, specifically into the rising industry of advertising. If a baby could be taught to fear a rat, Watson reasoned, then consumers could be taught to crave a product. By pairing goods with images of desire, security, or status, he could trigger emotions that drove behavior, and it worked. Watson became a pioneer of modern advertising, helping to shape a consumer culture that thrives on conditioned responses to this day. Meanwhile, what became of little Albert? Here the story grows darker still. The identity of the child was long shrouded in mystery. Records from the experiment were incomplete for decades. Historians debated who he was, what happened to him, and whether he carried his induced fears into adulthood. Recent research suggests Albert was most likely a boy named Douglas Moretti, the son of a wet nurse at Johns Hopkins. If this identification is correct, the tragedy deepens. Douglas was not the healthy, robust child Watson described. He may have suffered from hydrocephalus, a condition that enlarges the head and affects brain development, and he did not live to adulthood. Douglas married at the age of 6. If true, it means Albert's conditioned fears may have haunted only his brief life, but it also means Watson experimented on a neurologically compromised child without disclosure, without care, without concern for the consequences. Even if Douglas was not Albert, the truth remains, the boy's real name was hidden, his fate obscured. He was reduced to a case study, a footnote in history, while the man who conditioned his fear built a career out of it. And Rosalie Rayner, she married Watson, bore him children, and co-authored papers expanding on behaviorist ideas, yet she died young at only 36 of dysentery. Her role in the little Albert experiment is often overshadowed, but she too carried the weight of those choices. So what is the legacy? On the one hand, Watson proved something undeniable: behavior can be shaped by environment. Advertising, political propaganda, even modern education systems owe part of their design to that insight. On the other hand, he opened a Pandora's box. If fear can be created, so can prejudice, loyalty, obedience. The same principle that sold soap and cigarettes could also sell wars and ideologies. And at the heart of it all was a child, too young to consent, too powerless to resist, forever marked by the clang of steel. This is why the little Albert experiment is remembered not only as a milestone in science, but also as a cautionary tale in ethics. It reminds us that knowledge pursued without morality can turn discovery into harm, that the cost of proving a theory can sometimes be measured in human suffering. Watson gained fame, fortune and influence, but Albert gained fear. One left a legacy, the other was left broken. Step back now from the walls of Johns Hopkins, from the crib of little Albert, and let's widen the lens. The story of John B. Watson is not just about one man or one experiment. It's about a worldview of philosophy that sought to redefine what it means to be human. Watson's conviction was simple yet radical: humans are blank slates. Forget talk of souls, forget the unconscious mind, forget innate traits. To Watson, every thought, every emotion, every act of kindness or cruelty could be traced back to the environment. He dismissed the mystery of inner life and replaced it with stimulus and response. Show him behavior and he would show you the conditioning behind it. Give him a child, and he could shape the adult. On the surface it sounded scientific, modern, even liberating. If behavior is learned, then it can be unlearned. If fear is conditioned, it can be reconditioned. If poverty, crime or prejudice are behaviors, then society can re-engineer them. The promise was a kind of social engineering that could solve humanity's oldest problems. But beneath that promise lay a chilling implication: if all behavior is programmed, then human beings are programmable. The line between education and manipulation, between guidance and control, grows thin. Behaviorism clashed with older views of human nature. Philosophers had long debated whether we are born good or evil, free or determined. The religious tradition saw humans as souls shaped by divine will and moral choice. Freud saw unconscious drives bubbling beneath the surface, but Watson reduced it all to the mechanics of environment. No soul, no subconscious, only learning. And that reduction carries weight, for if we are only the product of conditioning, what becomes of free will? If your fears, your desires, even your loves, are nothing more than associations formed in childhood, do you truly choose them? Or are you living out a script written by others, by parents, teachers, advertisers, governments? This is why Watson's work feels both revolutionary and sinister. It broke the mystical aura around human psychology, but it also opened the door to seeing people as objects to be molded. To Watson, that wasn't necessarily bad. He once wrote proudly that society could use behaviorism to create better citizens, but the same tools that build can also enslave. And history shows us both sides. Behaviorism paved the way for therapies that helped people overcome phobias, addictions, and destructive habits, yet it also laid the foundation for manipulative advertising, political propaganda, and techniques of social control. The ghost of little Albert haunts this philosophy. His tears remind us that when behavior is studied without compassion, when theory tramples over ethics, the human cost is real. It's easy to talk of stimulus and response in the abstract, harder to remember that behind every response is a person, a child, a patient, a citizen whose life will be shaped by the experiment. Watson's behaviorism asked a question we still struggle with today: are we truly free? Or are we endlessly conditioned by forces we don't see? When you scroll through social media, when you buy a product because of a commercial, when you adopt a fear whispered repeatedly in the news, are those your choices, or are they echoes of a modern laboratory, a more sophisticated steel bar stuck behind your head? This is the legacy of behaviorism. It forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that our identities are not as stable or self-made as we imagine that we are. In Watson's eyes, creatures of habit, endlessly moldable, endlessly programmable. The story of John B. Watson and little Albert is not just a tale buried in the dusty archives of psychology. It's a mirror showing us how fragile the human mind can be, and how easily it can be bent. Watson left Johns Hopkins in disgrace, his academic career destroyed by scandal, yet his ideas did not vanish. In fact, they spread wider than ever, from the laboratories of universities to the offices of Madison Avenue, from classrooms to government agencies. The fingerprints of behaviorism appeared everywhere. Advertising, once about simple product information, became about shaping desire. Cigarettes paired with glamour, soap linked to purity, cars associated with status and freedom. Every ad was an echo of Watson's principle: connect a stimulus with an emotion, and the behavior will follow. Politics too learned from behaviorism. Propaganda during wars did not simply argue. It conditioned, it repeated, it paired images and words until loyalty and fear became reflexes. When Watson declared that humans are programmable, he may not have intended for governments and corporations to take the lesson so literally, but they did. And what about little Albert? For decades his fate was a mystery. He had no voice, no choice, no control. Only recently have researchers pieced together clues that he may have been Douglas Merritt, a child who lived only 6 short years. If true, the tragedy deepens. Albert did not live long enough to outgrow his conditioned fears, and his short life was marked by experiments he could never consent to. Even if Albert was someone else, the truth remains, his story became legend while his humanity was forgotten. He was reduced to an example in textbooks, remembered more as data than as a boy. This is the dark paradox of Watson's legacy. On one hand, behaviorism helped build therapies to cure phobias, to treat anxiety, to reshape destructive habits. On the other, it armed powerful institutions with tools to shape society itself. Whether for healing or for control depends not on the science, but on the hands that wield it. So what lesson do we carry forward? First, that knowledge without ethics is dangerous. Watson proved his point, but at the cost of a child's innocence. History remembers him as brilliant, but also as ruthless. His experiment is still taught not as a model to follow, but as a warning. Second, that we are more influenced than we realize. Every fear, every craving, every preference may carry echoes of conditioning by parents, by culture, by media. To understand this is not to despair but to awaken. Once you see the strings, you are less likely to be a puppet. And third, that freedom lies not in denying influence but in recognizing it. If you can trace your fear to its source, you can begin to reclaim it. If you can see how desires are manufactured, you can choose whether to obey them. Awareness becomes resistance. In the end, John B. Watson showed the world that behavior could be shaped. What he failed to show was compassion. What he proved, scientifically, he ignored ethically. And that is why the little Albert experiment remains infamous, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge must never trample the dignity of a human being. So the next time you feel a surge of fear or a sudden craving or even a reflexive belief, pause. Ask yourself, is this truly mine or is it a conditioned response planted long ago? Because Watson was right about one thing, we are creatures of conditioning. But what he left unsaid is this: if behavior can be programmed, it can also be reclaimed. The same mind that can be taught to fear can be taught to be free. And that perhaps is the greatest legacy of all,